Well, NATO members coming out with a big statement on agreeing to pull Ukraine closer to joining the security alliance, but it offered no specific timeline for membership. Let's bring in Yahoo Finance's Rick Newman. Rick, the lack of timeline really got a very strong response from Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, who called it unprecedented and absurd.
He's saying, speaking his mind there, it's definitely a disappointment for Ukraine. What Ukraine wanted was not immediate ascension into NATO. Nobody thought that was going to happen. But they wanted a timeline that was spelled out, that, with conditions such as once there's a ceasefire with Russia or once the war is over or something like that. Instead, it's just kind of a vague statement that NATO will consider Ukraine as a member when the time is right. All is not lost for Ukraine here. There still are some things going Ukraine's way. France just said they are going to give Ukraine some longer range missiles, which Ukraine has been begging for. It looks like they might get some F-16s this year. And, the way this works with NATO, I mean, it takes time. You're talking about, 31 countries now that Sweden is in, agreeing on something. And each one of these countries, the leaders of each one of these countries, has domestic political concerns. President Biden himself has said this is not quite the time for Ukraine, and America is the de facto leader of NATO. So not happening now, but it's not stopping either. They will keep working on it.
I mean, Rick, how much of this is just about the obligation that comes with NATO membership? If Ukraine becomes a member now during the war, that would inevitably pull in members into the war itself.
That is so. Experts on the NATO and the NATO Charter say that is not really true. So it's not as if an agreement to admit Ukraine. And again, we're talking about in the future. We're not talking about this happening this year. That would somehow obligate all the other NATO nations to actually put boots on the ground in Ukraine. I think that's a red herring. What's more interesting here is what message it sends to Russian President Vladimir Putin. So this is what Putin would want. And one reason that the United States and some other members of NATO don't want to give Ukraine such a clear pathway in just yet is this old concern that this would be a provocation to Vladimir Putin. So people who are more hardline about this are saying, come on already. I mean, look, Putin has backed down from one red line after another, and surely you can't worry about confronting him on this. But look, it's incremental. President Biden has broadly taken an incrementalist approach to this war, give Ukraine enough to survive, see how it does, then give it some more in terms of weapons and other types of aid. And I think that's the way it's going to go for NATO membership. So maybe this time next year, it'll look more promising for Ukraine joining NATO.
And Rick, you talk about aid, members of NATO really upping the aid to Ukraine. The U.S. specifically, the Biden administration has greenlit essentially these cluster bombs, which have really faced some opposition among lawmakers as well. I mean, what does that path look like? And put that in context for us, why that is such a concern.
The cluster munitions are going to Ukraine. That decision has been made, even though it's getting some pushback. So I listened, I'm paying a lot of attention to what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. And I listened to these arguments about why Ukraine should not use these. The short story here is the problem with cluster munitions is they leave a lot of unexploded ordnance behind. So once the war is over, these are deadly to civilians. But that's after the war is over. I mean, the most objectionable use of these things are when you are bombing somebody else's country. So Russia has used cluster munitions in Ukraine. Ukraine would be using them in its own country, which would give them a very powerful incentive to do the absolute best possible job, to do things like track where they use them, know where they are, so that once we ever get to the point of cleanup, they can go and clean them up. So make sure they're not dangerous to civilians. But they'd be using them in areas where there are no civilians because the Russians have militarily taken over these areas, and Ukraine is running out of other munitions. So This would be for Ukraine to use in lieu of artillery shells, which they're running short of. Which, let's remember, Ukraine is just getting started on this so-called counteroffensive to try to make some kind of breakthrough here. You can't micromanage an ally like this and say you can use these weapons but not this. I mean, it really does seem like they're going to be using it on their own territory. You have to let them make the decision about whether to use it, and they say they need them, so they're going.
Rick Newman, as always, giving us that context. Thanks so much for that.
Bye.